I'm Richard Harris, and welcome to Real Risk, the podcast that talks to people who put themselves in harm's way. You know the type. Big wave surfers, professional soldiers, base jumpers. I'll get inside the heads of men and women who seem fearless or even reckless. They might seem crazy to us, but most are far from it. We'll be talking about putting your life on the line for something important. We're talking about real risk. I've dived to a depth of 150 metres in the ocean and over 200 metres in various caves around the world. To descend to these depths is relatively straightforward, but to return safely to the surface is where the real skill lies. The experience required, the decision-making, the teamwork and the equipment are all significant factors in doing it safely. On some of these dives we wear nearly 100 kilograms of equipment, and the ascent takes many, many hours if you want to avoid decompression sickness or the bends. But imagine dropping to the same depths wearing just a light wetsuit and a couple of weights. Welcome to the sport of free diving. It's an ancient pursuit, but it's seeing a resurgence in popularity, with various organisations offering training and well-run competitions which allow athletes from around the world to test themselves in this domain. The physiology of breath hold diving is fascinating. Men and women are holding their breaths for longer than anyone could have imagined, and diving to depths that defy what we understood about the limits of human ability. My next guest is one such athlete. Born in the UK, raised in New Zealand, he and his partner now share their time between Long Island in the Bahamas and Okinawa in Japan. William Trubridge has held 15 world records over his stellar career. And if freediving is the purest form of underwater endeavours, then the constant weight, no fins category might be said to be the truest discipline within that sport. That means you simply swim straight down as far as you can. No fins to propel you, just you and the water. And William's record of 102 metres has stood firm for 4 years. And what's more, he reckons he's still got a bit left in the tank. G'day, William. Thank you very much for joining me on Real Risk.
Cheers, Richard. Good to be here.
So, William, free diving is an ancient art, over 2,000 years old, that women, especially in Korea and Japan, have been free diving to collect shellfish in particular, and those amazing women dive to 20 metres or more for a minute at a time, and they do that all day long. But my experience as a young person, and from what I understand yours as well, was that we explored the oceans through snorkeling, through looking at the ocean through a face mask, and so many people start out their journey in the ocean that same way. What's your first recollections? Tell me about how you got started.
Yeah, it's definitely like that for me. So my very first memories were of being a child living on a boat that my parents had brought to sail from Europe to New Zealand. And we spent 10 years almost living on that boat from when I was kind of 18 months until the age of 10. So all those very first memories of my childhood were of life living on the sea, in the sea, and like you said, kind of snorkeling, playing in the water pretty much the whole day.
There's been a massive resurgence in interest in free diving lately. A lot of people teaching it, a lot more people participating in it, which is fantastic. Why do you think that's happening? Is it because of watching guys like you do your thing?
I'm not sure. I definitely feel like there's a kind of a move towards more natural practices in sports. So we're seeing people kind of embracing ways of doing things, whether it's running or swimming, in the most kind of natural form. Even like in the gym, people are shirking the weights and doing free body exercises. And freediving is the kind of most natural expression of being underwater because you're unencumbered by any equipment. It's just your body and the water, and you kind of assimilate into it like a aquatic creature does.
Yeah, it's pretty minimalistic, isn't it? It's certainly an attraction to be able to just basically walk down to the water with your fins and your mask, and if you're in a nice warm place like you in the Bahamas, that's all you need to get going.
It's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum to what you're doing, I guess, where you need kind of all the equipment in order to support your life while you're going so deep into the caves.
It's funny, isn't it, that we wear 60 or 80 kilograms of equipment to basically dive to similar depths to what you guys are doing. And often I wonder, or I think to myself, wouldn't it be easier just to be doing this in my Speedos with a mask and snorkel? But obviously it's a very different sport, and we're going to talk a little bit about the physiology of free diving, which as a diving physician I find fascinating, the way you guys seem to have outsmarted the theoretical limits in physiological terms. Now, you're a British New Zealander, but you're living in the Bahamas?
Yeah, I was born in England and brought up in New Zealand, but now splitting between the Bahamas and Japan, actually. So myself and my partner, we travel backwards and forwards between the Bahamas and Japan during the year.
And you're on Long Island?
Yeah, Long Island, Bahamas.
And a lot of people won't have heard of Long Island, but they certainly will have heard of the famous freediving spot that you almost have made your own trademark in a way. Is that right?
Yeah, Dean's Blue Hole is by now kind of synonymous with freediving. It's definitely the best place to train and to compete. We hold the annual competition here, Vertical Blue, which is kind of the most prestigious event on the freediving calendar, and it attracts all the top freedivers in the world and there've been more world records set here than I think any other venue.
And a mutual friend, Brian Kaycook, has been recently doing a bit more exploration in that hole. Brian's a very well-known cave diver who's a good friend of both of ours. And I've done some diving with him in the Bahamas, which is without question the most beautiful cave diving in the world. And Brian has joined us on a couple of trips to places like Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean and out to the Nullarbor Plain in Western Australia. So I've been following Brian's activities in your special blue hole lately. He's been swimming all the way down, not quite to the bottom. I think it's about 202 metres is the bottom. Is that right?
Yeah, the very bottom is 202 meters. He's been actually doing something amazing, which is mapping the cave systems to the kind of the wings of the blue hole, because it expands into the second largest underwater chamber in the world. And there's cave systems connecting off that, which in theory eventually connect to the open ocean as well. And he's mapped those out to a distance of several hundred meters. And it's incredible to overlay that map on top of like a satellite image of the blue hole and see just how extensive this web of cave systems is underneath where we're parking our cars, where we're walking around the edge of the blue hole. It's mind blowing.
Yeah, I've seen those overlays actually, and you can see where it looks like it's going to snake out through the reef out into the open ocean, through the open ocean wall, I guess, lying on the outside of the reef there. And maybe one day you'll be able to do a little swim through, William, hold your breath and pop down and go through like that blue hole in Dahab.
Yeah, I think it'll be a little more challenging than that one.
How long have you been holding competitions in Dean's Blue Hole?
Since 2008 was our first year. And that year was just kind of like a bunch of mates, maybe there was 12, 15 of us, get together to, wouldn't call it compete because we were just competing against ourselves. It was like an opportunity for us to set national records, world records, and we were providing safety for one another. So it was a really informal kind of event, and it's grown from there to become the most high profile event where we have like a dedicated safety team that's probably the most professional in the world. We have an underwater drone that follows us down and up for the whole dive. Yeah, it's just kind of gone from strength to strength over the years.
There's a bit of a cult movie that free divers and scuba divers know about, the Big Blue or Le Grand Bleu, which came out, I think, in 1988. Do you think that had a big impact on the sport? Did we see a rise in popularity from that point?
Yeah, I was too young to kind of really notice that. But from what I know of the history of the sport, yes, that definitely did have a huge impact. And it's always been fairly big and well known in countries like France and Italy. But after that movie, it started to become well known outside of Europe.
Well, I've certainly seen a major increase in the popularity of the sport in Australia. One of the sinkholes or cenotes in the southeast of South Australia has become a very popular freediving training site, although the water temperature is only about 15 degrees. So that, I imagine, makes pursuing depth a little harder. It's harder perhaps to adjust your buoyancy and hold your breath for a longer time in cold water compared to nice tropical water. Is that?
Yeah, definitely. It's more of a challenge in cold water. You typically have to wear more neoprene, thicker wetsuits, and that means that you're more buoyant, so you have to add weight while you're diving. But when you reach maximum depth, you lose the buoyancy of your wetsuit because that's compressed. All the air spaces inside it are compressed. So then you're just left with the weight of the ballast that you've taken down. So it means that in terms of energy that you use during the dive, you expend a lot more. Not to mention the fact that being cold. If you start shivering, then you're obviously using your oxygen reserves more quickly.
For people who are listening to this podcast who don't really know anything about the sport of freediving, it's actually become quite complicated in a way because there are 9 categories now, and you can do all sorts of activities within the framework of this sport. You can lie face down in a pool and see how long you can hold your breath for, or you can swim laps of the pool underwater and see how far you can go without coming up for breath, or you can head downwards, and I guess that's what most people would think about initially with the sport of freediving, the quest for depth. But even within that quest, there are a number of different categories, and you seem to have specialised in a couple of those, William?
Yeah, so I'm definitely more of a depth freediver. I don't do so much in the pools, although obviously my training happens there a lot. And in the depth disciplines, the 2 that I specialize the most in, or the one that I see as the most important and put most of my time into, is definitely constant weight, no fins, which is basically the purest, most unassisted form of freediving. You don't get to wear any fins. You can't use the rope to pull yourself down. There's obviously no sled. So you're just swimming down with your hands and feet in a kind of adapted breaststroke. And that's the one where I currently hold the world record.
And that's 102 metres?
Yeah.
So I want people to think about that for a moment, just swimming head down, straight down, alongside a shot line or a rope that's heading down to the depth that's required, not touching or pulling on the rope, just some weights around your middle as much as you need to overcome the buoyancy of the wetsuit, and swimming down until you get to a point, I guess, where the wetsuit compresses, and then from that point on you don't need to actively swim, you just drop.
It's more about your lungs compressing. So the buoyancy of the wetsuit is minimal, especially in warm water. But the volume of the lungs at the start of the dive is 10 liters. So by the time we've reached, say, 30 meters, which is about where I enter the free fall, the lungs have dropped to 2.5 liters. So I've lost 7.5 liters of lung volume, which equates obviously to 7.5 kilos of buoyancy. From that point, I'm about kind of maybe 1.5 kilos negatively buoyant, and that picks up a little bit more during the free fall. So I reach a terminal velocity in the free fall of around about pretty close to 1 meter per second, just falling kind of head first, trying to stay streamlined close to the rope.
So that's actually a really rapid descent. In scuba diving terms, when we're diving on a deep shipwreck, for example, we aim to get to the bottom pretty quickly, and sometimes we might manage 40 to 50 meters per minute descent rate, which is really bombing it down to the bottom. So you're doing 60 meters per minute. So that's really flying. And when you get to the point at the bottom of the rope that you've got marked, I guess, because that's your target depth, you're allowed to grab hold of a tag at that point.
Yeah, we have to bring up a tag as a kind of testimony that we've been to that depth, even though we have cameras now, and we also have a dive watch attached to you, which records the whole dive. But it's just kind of like a physical confirmation of the fact you've been there, you've brought something back up from it.
At that rate, you're still racing down, and you've got to grab hold of this spot on the rope to get the tag. Is that actually physically hard to stop yourself, to put the brakes on and then turn around to come up?
Not really, because so I set an alarm, a depth alarm, just a few meters before I reached that depth. So I know to start to prepare. And when we have this kind of grace zone in the last 2 meters before the dive plate at the bottom, where you're actually allowed to use the rope just to kind of stop your descent and start the ascent. So we can hold on to it once at the very bottom there. And while you're holding on to it, you grab the tag and then just pull once on the rope to start moving upwards. And from there, you're swimming.
And then you have to swim back up to that 30-meter-ish point until your buoyancy takes over and assists you.
Yeah, it's more like to get sufficient positive buoyancy just to float up, you're swimming pretty much almost all the way to the surface. Like the last 5-8 meters, maybe you can stop swimming, but up until there, you're working the whole way.
So I'm going to put a YouTube link for the dive that you achieved your world record, because I find myself unconsciously holding my breath as you leave the surface. And I know I've spoken to a lot of people who watch this sort of diving on videos, and everyone says the same thing. They hold their breath when the diver leaves the surface, and after about 30 seconds, we're all kind of done in, and 4 minutes later, Is it about 4 minutes where you reach the bottom, or is it?
No, it's a round trip of about 4 minutes, or just a little more.
A round trip of 4 minutes. Yeah, that's a very long time. For someone like me who's, very comfortable in the water, and I started out snorkeling, and I did do a bit of free diving, particularly in the context of spearfishing from time to time. How do you convert someone like me who can dive to, 10 meters and swim around for about 20 seconds and come back to the surface? How do you convert that to progressing in the sport? What's most important? Is it the mind over matter, or is it the fitness and the athleticism?
To begin with, it's mostly about relaxation. So for someone who hasn't trained freediving before, it's mostly just about like getting you to relax before the dive and during the dive itself, and making sure that you're not hyperventilating. So just focusing on your breathing and having just passive, shallow breathing is enough. The same breathing that you're doing as you're speaking to me, or if you're listening to this while you're kind of relaxing in a chair or on a couch, then that breathing that you're doing right now is sufficient to keep homeostasis, to keep all your levels of CO2 and oxygen at the same state. And if you influence that too much by overbreathing, so breathing more, then your CO2 levels start to drop. You don't actually store more oxygen from overbreathing, but you do reduce your carbon dioxide. And that's what makes it feel easier to hold your breath, but actually limits your potential, because it limits your oxygen conservation mode. And it also limits the signals that you get from your body about the urge to breathe and when to come back up. And so it makes it less safe as well. So there's two very good reasons not to hyperventilate, and just to focus on what we call tidal breathing, just passive diaphragmatic breathing.
I imagine all the guys at your level in this sport have become pretty familiar with the physiology of freediving, and it's obviously very important for you to understand so that you can maximise your performance. And I've noticed the same thing in technical divers. They're all very cognizant of diving medicine. They understand decompression, illness, and the pathophysiology pretty well, and certainly they understand the management of the symptoms of it very, very well. But the physiology of freediving has always fascinated me with my background in diving medicine. And my understanding was that for a long time there was a kind of theoretical depth limit of around 60 metres that academics said no one can really pass that point because of the compression of the lungs. So as you mentioned, when you leave the surface with your 10 litres of air in your lungs and you get to 10 metres, Boyle's law will say the pressure's doubled, so the lung volume will halve, and that continues with every 10 metres. 20 metres a third the volume, 30 metres a quarter the volume. And so by the time you get to 60 metres, they theorised that really your lungs couldn't shrink any further without imploding, I guess. But now that we know, people have dived to depths of over 200 metres, and the physiology of that is extraordinary. That perhaps your lungs might start to fill with fluid, and in fact the thoracic cavity might collapse and fill with fluid as well. Do you feel that? What do you feel as you dive to those sort of depths?
You feel it a little bit, but ideally if you have developed the sufficient kind of flexibility in the whole system, not just in your rib cage, the enclosure around your lungs, but also in the rigid airways, which is your trachea and bronchi and bronchioles. If you've developed flexibility in all of those, then you shouldn't feel any effects of the pressure. But if you're more rigid, then obviously you're going to feel the negative pressure inside those air spaces as they want to shrink more but can't, and so it kind of creates a vacuum effect inside. And that vacuum effect, that negative pressure, is what eventually will cause barotrauma, cause damage by like bursting capillaries, and pulling blood and plasma and fluids into the air spaces of the lungs. So that's what they thought kind of 60 odd years ago, is that we have this kind of semi-rigid system of the rib cage and the lungs. And they felt like it would reach its limits of flexibility at around 50, 60 meters. What they hadn't counted on was the fact that the blood vessels, the capillaries which flow through the lungs, super flexible themselves and can engorge with blood up to several times their initial diameter. And so we get what's called a hemocompensation, which is where the blood flows into those capillaries more and protects the lungs because it's compensating for the loss of volume due to pressure. But you need both systems. You need to be very flexible in the chest, rigid airways, the thoracic cavity, as well as have this reflex where the capillaries fill up with blood.
Does that flexibility of the chest cavity, does that mean that there's an age limit to this sport for being competitive? Because that's one of the things that will start to change as we get older. You know, the joints between the ribs and the sternum, where there's a cartilage, probably play a role in this flexibility, and that starts to get a bit calcified and crusty. So maybe would that be one of the reasons why 50-year-olds aren't setting records?
Well, to a certain extent, like if you were to start at that age, then you'd probably have more of a job to do to develop that flexibility than someone who's come into the sport very early. But having said that, there have been people in their 50s. Until recently, the world record holder for the women was Natalia Molchanova, who was still smashing world records at the age of 53. And she started when she was, I think, in her late 30s or even 40. So, yeah, there is no kind of hard and fast limitations that we've come across so far in the sport.
While we're on the topic of physiology, I'd like to just talk through a dive in all its phases with you, William, because something bizarre and nasty is trying to happen to your body with all the different phases of the dive. But just take even a step back. If you had a world championship coming up in a couple of months, when would your training for that start?
Yeah, I'm pretty much training all year round. So I take about a month off of the year, and the rest of the time is fairly consistent training. Obviously, there's different phases that I go through, and those phases are designed to kind of put me in the best condition possible for an event, the most important event of the year. So typically that's kind of late northern summer, so around kind of September odd. And that means that I'll be mostly doing base training over the period of kind of November through to March or so, and then doing more specific depth training from March onwards. And prior to the competition itself, I'll taper off to doing a lot less volume, but more intensity. So just kind of one-off deep dives with a lot of recovery time so that I'm making sure that I'm fully recovered when I come into the competition.
Because those really deep dives, as you ascend, obviously the oxygen levels, the partial pressure of oxygen in your system starts to fall, both because you've been consuming oxygen, but more importantly because you're ascending through the water column, and the pressure around you is falling. So the pressure of oxygen in your brain, which is the thing that keeps you conscious, is starting to fall. Is that a real balancing act? Is that where the skill in terms of the timing and knowing your own body comes, that you can judge exactly on the way down? I can go a little more. If I don't turn back now, then I won't get back to the surface. Is that a juggling act?
Yeah, there's really no way to tell for sure on the way down, because bear in mind that the descent accounts for only maybe kind of 20-30% of the actual work that you do in the dive. Most of the work is on the ascent, because that's where you're negatively buoyant for pretty much the whole way up. So to give you an example, in a 100-meter dive, I might use maybe 7 or 8 strokes to go down before I start free fall. On the way back up to come to the surface would require more than 30, like 32 or so. So it would be impossible to kind of judge on the way down based on how you're feeling, whether or not you're going to be able to swim back to the surface, which means that we can only kind of dive very conservatively, pushing out 1 or 2 meters at a time if we felt like the previous dive was completely not easy, but very manageable. And we've managed to kind of isolate all the variables so that they're the same as that dive. So if you come out at the same time of day, with the same equipment, the same team in the same place, same conditions, and you attempt a dive that's 1 meter deeper than the dive you did 3 days ago, that was straightforward, then you should be okay. Obviously, there's kind of curveballs that can be thrown into that. There's all sorts of variables that we can't account for, and that's why we have a safety team, so that if you do misjudge it, they're there to help you out. And yeah, in those cases, if you've misjudged it, obviously you're not going to run out of oxygen at the halfway point at their maximum depth. You're going to run out right at the end when you're very close to the surface. So the safety team comes down to meet us at like 20, 30 meters on the way back up, and escorts us back to the surface from that depth.
That level of judgment implies to me that an occasional loss of consciousness on the way back to the surface or very close to the surface is kind of almost expected to happen from time to time, because when you're pushing for world records, you're on a knife edge, I guess, in terms of doing the very best you can, just getting that extra meter, and occasionally you're going to misjudge that and get it wrong. So, if you did lose consciousness, and I presume it happens to pretty much everyone who's been in the sport for long enough, is that considered a bit of a disgrace in the sport, or is that considered a sporting injury, a minor mishap that's easily managed?
There's a kind of a scale of blackout. So if you come to the surface and you're out for a few seconds, which is the most common one, there's not much of a disgrace around that. That's just a very, very minor misjudgment. And as you say, when you're pushing your limits the whole time, then that's going to happen every so often. If you black out on the way up at kind of 10, 20 meters from the surface, that shows that you've really misjudged your ability. You've been maybe reckless, or done something completely wrong in the dive. And so that would be more kind of embarrassing, I guess.
And does the safety officer give you a bit of a look or a bit of a talking to if that happens?
Well, typically you would get a full review from the medical team afterwards, and the safety team, who would they'd need to clear you in order to dive again at that event. But typically, like in my own diving, if I know that, like on the way back up, if I feel okay, it's not going well, there's a chance that I might not make it to the surface, then often in no fins, what I can do is abort the dive, which means that I just basically start pulling up on the rope, which makes it a lot easier to ascend, because you have this rigid point of pulling. And so, yeah, if I start doing that, then even if I was kind of going to be close to the limit, normally that is enough to be able to ensure that I get to the surface without any incident. Obviously, it means I'm disqualified, because in the no fins discipline, you cannot use any assistance at all. But it's better to be disqualified than to have an incident, of course.
And I guess that's a signal to the safety divers that you're not happy, and they come in a bit closer.
Yeah, and they may even give us a hand, kind of just reach under your shoulders and help to lift you back up to the surface if they're feeling charitable for the day.
You're listening to Real Risk, the adventure podcast with Richard Harris. So back to my physiology investigation. So you're ready to dive, you're lying on the surface. What's the process at that point?
In that phase before the dive, we used to call it the breathe up, but now we've actually changed the name to the relaxation phase to reflect the fact that relaxation is more important than breathing in that period. So we're just trying to be as completely relaxed as possible, checking through all the body parts that you have, kind of doing an inventory and making sure that every piece is relaxed. You're not kind of harboring any tension anywhere in your body. And for the breathing, you're just breathing very shallow, tidal breathing with the diaphragm. So just small amounts of air going into your belly, essentially. And the last couple of breaths before you do the dive, the last 2 or 3, we do what's called purge breaths, where you take a full, deeper breath and a full exhale as well, just to make sure that the lungs kind of are completely replenished with fresh air before you start the dive.
Is anyone still doing that lung packing or insufflation or glossopharyngeal breathing or whatever we're calling it this week?
Yeah, no, we're pretty much all still doing that, because it does increase your lung volume significantly. In my case, I think it accounts for an extra liter and a half, 2 liters, but that's on the low side. There's plenty of athletes who can pack in kind of an extra 3 or 4 liters with that technique. And it helps not just to increase your oxygen stores, but for those people who have difficulties equalizing, it obviously makes that easier as well.
Part of packing in that extra litre or two, I gather, is not just for oxygen levels, but the air clearing, as you mentioned, but also to increase the volume so that for those pursuing the super deep depths, that can actually potentially increase the depth they can go to because it will prevent that sort of terminal lung collapse.
Yeah, essentially it's correct. Although I feel like at a certain point, if you can reach, say, 100, 120 meters and your lungs are fine, then the difference going past that depth, the difference in lung volume, the drop in lung volume is very small and would be able to be accommodated by a very small increase in the blood volume inside the lungs. So once you get to a certain level, I don't think there's any risk of kind of lungs collapsing anymore. In the same way that like the aquatic mammals, some of them dive to 2-3 kilometers under the water because they're completely flexible. They have this huge blood shift into the lungs to protect them. So it doesn't matter what depth they go to, they're going to be able to accommodate it.
So one of the concerns when people return to the surface, and I know that the risk of this is low, and it's questionable whether it's even ever caused a serious incident or a fatality, but the concern about the lungs actually having trouble clearing the blood or fluid at the end of the dive, and divers surfacing, coughing out a bit of blood or having respiratory problems. And there was talk about the incident of Nick Mevoli, who actually died on the surface at Dean's Blue Hole in 2013, and the question of whether that was caused by that particular problem. Have you had any sensations of breathing difficulties or coughed up blood or anything like that at the end of a dive?
No, I haven't had any myself. Although I'll clarify that by saying I haven't ever coughed up any blood myself during a dive. But on very deep dives, sometimes we have what's called like a low-grade pulmonary edema, which means that there is fluid there in the lungs, and you can kind of detect it if you do a forceful exhale. You hear those kind of the rails, the kind of crackling at the end of the exhale. So I have had that, and they've done tests immediately after dives where they've shown that pretty much all freedivers who go to significant depths have a certain amount of that. So there is a certain amount of fluid leakage across the barrier between the blood vessels and the alveoli. But what happens in the serious cases where you have blood is that it's obviously compromising the blood vessels themselves, and so the blood is passing through into the air spaces, and that's blocking the oxygen uptake once you return to the surface. And it's something that's happening probably at maximum depth. So there was a theory for a while that when we come back to the surface and the lungs reinflate, it puts pressure on the blood vessels, and there might be some kind of an injury from that. But the common understanding now is that it's more to do with the severe negative pressure inside the lungs at depth, and potentially combined with kind of sudden movements of skeletal muscle around the thorax, as well as perhaps what we call breathing reflexes, which are where your body is kind of trying to take a breath underwater. It sounds scary because it sounds like you might breathe in water, but it's something that we go through when we're holding our breath. If you're doing like the regular breath hold in the pool, static apnea, you might get kind of 40 or 50 of those before you throw in the towel. So if that happens at depth and the system, your rib cage, your thorax, the lungs, is already kind of at its limit of what it can stand in terms of negative pressure, and you throw in this contraction, it can be kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, and that causes damage inside the lungs, which causes the fluids and the blood to leak in. And then when you come back to the surface, that's when all of that starts to have an effect, because it's blocking oxygen uptake. It's compromising your ability to reoxygenate after the dive.
So does this limit attempts at a deep dive, say to 100 metres, to really one a day, because you know that your lungs have got a bit of fluid in them probably for a period of time, or does that feel like it clears very quickly and you can have another crack in an hour or so?
It does clear pretty quickly, yeah. Depending on the severity, but a very minor case might clear up straight away, such that if you're wearing a pulse oximeter after the dive, you don't really see any evidence of it at all. But the main reason why we can't do more than one deep dive in a day is the same reason as for yourselves. We start to risk DCS as well.
We'll get on to talk about that. I mean, that's an amazing principle that many people won't have even thought about, the fact that you can get the bends or decompression sickness from free diving. We've talked about the relaxation and preparing your lungs for the dive. So at some point you decide you're ready and you roll over. Talk us through the descent. What does that feel like to dive to 100 meters in a blue hole?
To dive down feels good. It's very relaxing. As I said before, you only really need to take, in my case, 7 or 8 strokes, and then I can just relax into the free fall and get a free ride down from there. It's the way up where you kind of pay the price for that free ride.
One of the issues of diving deep with a lung full of nitrogen and oxygen, which is air, of course, what we're breathing right now, is the potential for nitrogen narcosis or the raptures of the deep, which is something that's very well known to scuba divers as well. We're told not to dive more than 30 to 40 meters using air because you start to lose the ability to concentrate. You feel sometimes relaxed, sometimes very anxious, but certainly, the concentration's a big problem. You look at your computer on your wrist and you think you've read it and understood it, and then you glance away and you think, I have no idea what that just said, and you look back at it and the same process repeats. Have you ever had the sense that you've been under the weather or felt narcotized at depth?
Definitely, yes. Narcosis is a big element in deep freediving, but it's my theory, and we have quite a bit of evidence for this, that the narcosis we experience is more due to carbon dioxide than it is to nitrogen. I feel like nitrogen is there as well, nitrogen narcosis, and it maybe compounds the CO2 narcosis as well. But I think that most of the effect is from the CO2, because one of the key indicators of this is that the narcosis actually peaks on the way up. So after we've hit maximal depth and we turn around and start swimming back up, maybe kind of a third of the way back up is about where it starts to peak. So that's showing that because we're continually creating CO2, especially once we start swimming on the way up, even though the partial pressure is dropping, the actual concentration of CO2 in solution is increasing. And so the net partial pressure is probably reaching a peak somewhere on the ascent. And that wouldn't happen with nitrogen. Nitrogen would peak probably closer to the bottom. Yeah, the experience is similar to what I've heard of it related with scuba diving, except maybe it's more, how do I say this? So it seems to kind of exacerbate any state that you are experiencing in the dive. If the dive is going really well, then it makes it feel euphoric. If you're starting to get a little nervous or worried in the dive, then the narcosis can make you start to almost panic. It just acts as a kind of catalyst for any sensation or emotion that you're experiencing during the dive.
Yeah, I would say I experienced similar emotions with narcosis. If I'm in the tropics and the pretty fish are everywhere, I can feel pretty buzzed and pretty happy with it. But if I'm deep inside a shipwreck in cold water, and I can feel a bit very tense indeed. And it's fascinating to talk about CO2 and narcosis because obviously as a critical care doctor, I see patients unconscious from CO2 at ambient pressure at 1 atmosphere if it's sufficiently high. So there's no doubt that CO2 is intensely narcotic to the point of being an anesthetic if it's sufficiently high in your bloodstream. And you guys must be getting up there by the time you get back to the surface. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that that's probably a major contributor to that problem. The other thing that we see in deep diving as scuba divers is with rapid descent, particularly to 200 meters, is this problem called the high pressure neurological syndrome, which is a pressure effect on the neurons, on the nerve cells, which makes them excitable as opposed to gas narcosis, which makes them depressed like alcohol or any other sedative drugs. And that can elicit itself as tremors in your hands or nausea or visual hallucinations. And so for the guys who are diving to 200 metres with those 60 metre per minute descents, I wonder whether anyone's described any of those sorts of problems.
So there's only just a couple of guys who have dived to 200 meters, and that's the sled diving disciplines, which have more or less become redundant in freediving in the sense that no one trains or attempts those records anymore. It's seen kind of more as a stunt in freediving, whereas the disciplines which we compete in are more of like an athletic discipline. Yeah, and sled diving, it's very technical. It's about like how fast you can get the sled to move, whether your safety systems are in order, and then it just comes down to if you can equalize. There's not too many people for whom that's very attractive anymore, I guess. But yes, in those dives to 200 meters, they're actually moving at a lot quicker than 60 meters per minute because they have these extremely weighted sleds. And I'm not sure exactly, but I think they're getting up to like 180 meters per minute. So down and up can happen in kind of 2.5, 3 minute stops, which is not a very long time to hold your breath if you're not doing anything but holding onto the sled.
Maybe that's the sport for me. Maybe that's my discipline.
Yeah.
If I could just get a 60-second round trip.
Exactly. It's a lot of fun. But basically you're just dunking a tea bag to 200 meters. There's not a lot of kind of...
Have you had a go at that, William?
I've only ever used it as like a training tool in order to work on equalization and in-depth adaptation, but I've never actually seriously toyed with it as a discipline in and of itself.
So that's the other link that I'll put in the show notes is the video of Tanya Streeter, who has the world record of 160 metres on the no limits sled, as William's just described. And again, I can't feel anything but terrified watching the video. And it's those watching those dives, I think, despite the extremely good safety record your sport has, at least in the competition setting, watching the dives is what people see and think that looks like the most dangerous sport in the world. And it's funny, if you Google most dangerous sports, which is part of my research in doing this podcast series, as I want to talk to everyone who appears in those Google lists, freediving actually appears pretty frequently, and yet the statistics don't support that at all. In fact, my understanding is that on the last series of dives that have been done, of 50,000 competitive free dives, there's only been that one fatality, the chap I already talked about. Whereas in amateur diving, unsupervised, untrained people, the risks are indeed very high, and much shallower diving, of course.
Yeah, if you don't know much about the sport and you go out, especially if you go out by yourself and try it, even if it's in the pool or in shallow water, then it's extremely dangerous. It's extremely easy to overbreathe and to push yourself well past your limits. And similarly, the sled discipline, sled diving, has a really bad track record. So I think of all the people who have attempted world records in those disciplines, like the attrition is pretty high. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we're trying to distance ourselves from those disciplines. You can no longer attempt a world record with the official bodies in those disciplines because it devalues the sport, because it's kind of a stunt, because it has such a poor safety record. It doesn't really offer much in return to the sport. So the athletic disciplines is where we're focusing now. And yeah, like you said, in those, the safety record in competitions has been very good.
The overarching body is AIDA, AIDA?
There's two organizations, yeah.
Can you say in French what that stands for?
Putting me on the spot. It's something like Association Internationale Development of diving. No, it's not diving because that's plongée and French. It's development, I think, of apnea, which is breath hold.
Anyway, that is so. There's another body that also supervises the sport or has responsibility.
Yeah, there's also CMAS, which is the body that's affiliated with the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. So they also hold world championships and freediving competitions. And we're hoping, it's been one of my projects recently to try and kind of encourage these two bodies to unify. And we've actually been working on developing a freediving World Series, which would hopefully be a vehicle for unification of the sport with those two bodies.
Because the chap who actually started or promoted the idea of the AIDA passed away diving himself.
One of the guys who helped to found it, yes, Loic Lafirme, he was one of the sled divers who was lost while training in that discipline.
Back to our theoretical dive, William. We're descending. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was equalization, which you mentioned. You know, most divers or snorkelers have at some point had trouble clearing their ears, and the worst possible approach to successful ear clearing is basically to go head down, head first, and go as fast as possible down a rope. So how do you approach that? And tell me about this idea of people filling up their sinuses and ears with saline or water. I can't imagine doing that.
Yeah, so how long have you got? Because equalization is a huge topic. It is one of the main kind of complications, things that renders freediving pretty difficult. The maneuvers that we use for equalizing in scuba diving and snorkeling are mostly predicated on being able to develop exhalatory pressure with the lungs in order to push the air up into the middle ear. And when you get down past 20, 30 meters where your lungs drop below residual volume, then by definition, you cannot exhale at that depth. So you cannot generate any exhalatory force. And so from that depth to whatever depth you're going to, you have to come up with different techniques. And we generally use a technique called Frenzel, which is where you use your tongue like a piston to compress the air in your nasal chambers, and that pushes the air from there into your eustachian tubes and your middle ear. And in order for that to work, though, you still need to have air stored in your mouth to compress back up into your nasal chamber. And so we do what's called a mouth fill, where you basically like puff out your cheeks like a chipmunk at a depth of around 20, 30 meters. And then you can shut off the upper airways from your lungs by closing the glottis. And then your lungs continue to compress and lose their volume, but you have enough air in your cheeks stored in your mouth in order to be able to equalize your ears for the rest of the descent. And the technique of filling your nasal cavities and everything with saline, it's extremely awkward, uncomfortable, and off-putting. And I don't know of anyone who's been able to use that with any success in the athletic disciplines. Again, when you're attached to a sled, you can be head up, which makes it a lot easier. You don't have to think about anything other than equalization. And so in that discipline, I think there's one guy who was using it. But no, for the athletic disciplines, there's no cases I've heard of people who have been able to flood their sinuses and ears. Especially, it might work a few times, but your risk of infection in those spaces would be pretty high too.
I'm really, really pleased to hear you say that, because I was imagining for to launch myself into the sport successfully, I was going to have to learn how to do that most painful of procedures and fill up my head with saline. So that's good news to me.
Yeah, I can't handle it. I tried it, just like a few centimeters of water into my nose, and I was straight away coughing and splurting and everything. So that's not for me.
What do you think the future of the sport is, William? Have we reached, you'd never say we've reached the limits of where you can go, because in athletic endeavours in any field, you're always surprised when someone new comes along and blows everyone else literally out of the water in your sport. But do you think we're on the flat part of the curve, that the growth is going to be slow and incremental now?
It seems like it, yeah. If you trace the world records, the development of world records in these disciplines, then it's definitely it's flattening off at the depths we're reaching now. So obviously 102 meters is not a limit in this discipline that I specialize in, no fins. We can definitely go deeper than that, but whether we'll go another 10 or 20 meters deeper is not so sure. There's just this kind of like gray zone of uncertainty where we're just trying to kind of push as far as we can into that. Yeah, I guess take this concept of human aquatic potential as deep as we can.
I mean, there's a balance, isn't there, between being super fit and, minimal body fat, being an incredibly efficient oxygen-using machine that can, and we haven't even talked about the diving reflex and your ability to slow your heart rate down, minimise your basal oxygen consumption. Do you think genetics is a big part of this?
Genetics definitely is a part of it. And it comes into play very strongly in the pool disciplines. For example, in static apnea, which is just your straight breath hold, lying face down in the pool, someone who is very tall and lean, so has a very large lung volume, but very minimal body mass, is effectively they're like a very economical car with a huge gas tank. And so they're going to be able to hold their breath a lot longer than someone who has a lot more body mass but smaller lung volume. In depth, though, one of the reasons why I like the depth discipline so much is because they're kind of like a great equalizer. They take away a lot of the natural advantage that we might have acquired from genetics. So someone who has huge lung volume will then have to either choose between strapping on a bunch of weight, in which case they're going to be left very negatively buoyant at the bottom when they turn at the bottom, or trying to swim down with that huge lung volume, in which case it's like me trying to swim down when I'm attached to a buoy. Yeah, in depth, lung volume is not really as significant. And you can see that in the aquatic mammals. Most of them, the ones that go deepest, actually choose to exhale before they dive because they've succeeded in storing most of their oxygen in their tissues, in the myoglobin and the hemoglobin in the blood. So, and the same with a lot of other kind of natural attributes which you think might be an advantage in freediving. When it comes to depth, there doesn't seem to be any kind of clear-cut physiology. We had a girl who set the world record for no fins freediving, who was Japanese. She was quite short, and she had very, very small hands and feet. I remember putting my hand up against hers, and I think I could curl over my fingers right over the top of hers. So the fact that she was able to power herself down and up with very small surface area for paddles means that she must have been accommodating for it in some other aspect. So I think in depth, there's so many different features and components that need to be trained together that your chance of having a natural advantage or a natural ability in all of those simultaneously is slim to none.
And the static apnea world record, the face down breath holding is well over 11 minutes now, which is, again, incomprehensible. It's just amazing feat of athleticism. Did you check that girl for webs between her fingers, William? I mean, there's something going on there.
Yeah, maybe she had like retractable webs that we didn't know about, or gills or something else. But no, sadly, she actually passed away a year ago, not in freediving related, from a tragic accident.
Would you be happy to talk about any of your incidents or near misses, William? Have you had a few frights over the years?
Yeah, I've had a number of blackouts. Pretty much all the competitive freedivers who have been attempting world records have had incidents at some points in their careers, and I've definitely had a few, especially early on when we're not so kind of fine tuned to our ability to the signals that we're receiving from our body. And so we're maybe a little more gung-ho as well. And in that phase of my career, I had more of those kind of incidents.
I must say that the appearance of a diver who surfaces close to or actually unconscious is pretty awful. I mean, the colour of the bluish black face of the diver is an awful thing to watch, and occasionally they need a little bit of assistance to get them breathing again. But clearly the systems in place with the safety divers and the medical officers on the pontoon are very effective and well organised. So as we've discussed, the fatality rate has been impressively small.
Yeah, we've definitely developed it, especially since the death of Nick Mavoli, the American who died actually here in Dean's Blue Hole in 2013. And since then, we kind of went over every aspect of safety and the medical team. And we have more equipment on the dive platform than we actually do at the local clinic here. We have everything from CPAP breathing devices to suction, obviously the Zoll machine, which is the defibrillator, yeah, and then all sorts of drugs. And we feel like we have most contingencies covered. But yeah, as athletes push themselves deeper and deeper every year, and we get more and more athletes coming to these events, we have to always try and stay ahead of that, and stay ahead of the next potential incident which could occur.
And what about deep safety divers? Are you still using rebreather divers for the deep safeties at all?
No, not so much. Definitely not in competition. So when I've used deep rebreathers divers in the past, it's been for standalone record attempts because they could not just provide my safety, but also film myself down at those depths. These days in competitions, we have an underwater drone called Dive Eye, which follows us down from the surface to the maximum depth and back up again. And so you can actually see in real time on the surface what the diver is doing. And they're attached to the dive line by means of a running lanyard. So you have this lanyard attached to your body and clipped off on a carabiner on the rope. And if anything happens, if you should have a blackout at depth, which so far hasn't happened in competitions, fortunately not at significant depths. But if it were to happen, then you would see that both on the underwater drone and also on a fish finder, like a sonar device that we use, which spots what depth the athlete is at. And yeah, as soon as they stop moving back towards the surface, then you would activate the counterballast, which is a way to pull up the whole entire dive rope with the base plate and everything attached to it. And so that will catch your carabiner on your lanyard and pull you up with it. And it ascends very fast. It ascends at like over a meter per second. So you would get essentially a free ride back to the surface if that happens.
I imagine you want to keep your fingers away from that machine when you fire it up.
Yeah. The weight on the other side of the platform, which is responsible for pulling everything up, that goes down very quickly, and that's about 50 kilos of lead. So you don't want to get in the way of that either.
What's the future for William Trubridge? Have you hit your peak, or are you still got a bit more in the tank, do you think?
No, I still feel like there's definitely depth out there, and I'm still very motivated to try and get it. And I still feel like I'm improving in terms of how I'm training my base abilities. I'm always striving to go deeper.
Well, hopefully one day I can come and have a squiz at Dean's Blue Hole with my friend Brian Kaycook and go and look at his caves. And while we're there, we'll go for a little bit of a snorkel, William. That would be good.
You definitely should, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a fascinating chat. I hope it hasn't been too much physiology for the listeners, but certainly an interesting area, and what you guys can do with your bodies is extraordinary. And I hope we certainly haven't found the limits yet. So thanks again.
Thanks, Richard. It's been good. Cheers.
That's it for this episode of Real Risk. If you're a risk taker or know someone who'd be good for the show, please send me an email on admin@speleopix.com.au. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think of the podcast. Subscribe, give me a rating, but most importantly, join me for the next one. We'll see you again on Real Risk.